then taken the opportunity to reflect on my own research trajectory, how it's been influenced by policy, and what implications this might have for the future, And this is more autobiographical, in a sense, more personally autobiographical, because I was quite interested in looking at my CV. I went to say, well, what have I done? And how did it come to happen? And a lot of my work recently has been around autobiography. So one of the things I will say to you is don't believe what I say. Because autobiography, as we know, the authors shape the account in their interests. So there are probably a lot of things you should distrust about my account. But I've tried to be as open as I can without letting me down too much. So, but what I want to do first is reflect on my own experiences of education, early experiences. And I've listened to quite a lot of others, feminists and other people, about their working class backgrounds. And although I come from I would call a working class background, I've never kind of resonated with those accounts. And so I've been thinking about that as well. And I've long realised that I come from a poor background, low income and single parent. But it's only comparatively recently I've understood that intellectually. I've never thought, it was my daughter actually who said, but you were poor, Mum, when you were young. You know, and I never thought of myself as poor. My childhood was spent in a part of North London where pretty much everyone was poor, and also from minority or immigrant background, and that kind of resonates with nowadays. Like lots of other people in my neighbourhood, my clothes were homemade, there wasn't enough money for holidays, consumption was minimal, but the thing is that I did not feel poor. My identity was shaped much more at school by my migrant status, having a foreign-sounding name. I wanted to be called Barbara. Parents and relatives who spoke with heavy accents. Being big, I was quite chubby at the time, though not when you look at photographs. I wasn't as chubby as I thought I was. Having a foreign-sounding name, parents and relatives who spoke with heavy accent, and I mean heavy accents, and being from a politically left-wing family. Therefore, for me, accounts about what it feels to be an academic with a working-class background didn't resonate with my identity, nor seem to represent me. And I'm interested in discussions about social class because such a lot of the autobiographical accounts have been about white working class in the north or often in other parts of the country, and they haven't had, ethnicity hasn't been part of it, and I think it's quite interesting because I think it's very different. So the literature that spoke to me were either ground theories about social class, and I remember at college, I went to Sydney Webb Teachers Training College, when I first heard Marxist analysis about social class, it blew my mind. Or more specific to, so grand theories about social class, or more specific to my family history of persecution and migration. But what I did share with these other accounts were the perception of being an outsider to what might be called the establishment. And I don't know if you've read Owen Jones's book, which is fun. It's really depressing as well. In terms of, so I was in terms of my schooling, which was inner city and state, my accent, and I remember people saying, you sound so London, Gaby, you sound so London. And my behaviour, you're so direct, you're so funny. So those are the kind of responses to me that I found quite difficult to take, although they didn't sound hostile. More recently, like others of my generation, I've become to realise that though many of us of my generation were disadvantaged in many ways, we were fortunately benefited from post-war welfare policies, expanding educational opportunities and a buoyant labour market. So I've never been out of work. Never had that, which a lot of course, the latter generations have. So in reflecting what living in poverty has meant for me and for generations in the UK following World War II, and I know that Val Walker and other people have talked about that, it is important, as others have also suggested, to adopt a contextualised and nuanced understanding of the phenomenon of being poor. And this is where working in other countries comes in, enabling to see what we do here in a different light. Just to say that I spent 7 years in Sweden at the turn of the millennium, and it totally transformed my view of my own country, as well as working in a different country. It was deeply transformative. And so I will refer to that as I go through this talk. But first, I've got 4 things I want to say about myself. This is where it's a bit... I've always regarded myself as an educationist, although many of the research studies I've been involved in might be considered to be sociology of education or social policy. This is important because, as I was reminded recently, education is an applied science rather than a social science. In Swedish, it has an ik ending, pedagogik, didaktik, and a juridik, which is the law, to denote the involvement of technique and practicality rather than an I ending, as in sociology and psychology. So in Sweden, they've got different endings for different subjects, which denote their applications, their subject status as an applied science or a pure science. I started out as a primary teacher, albeit with one of the first 4-year BEds, which have now been phased out. And although interested in theoretical developments, have tended always to be interested in how research findings can be applied. So that's where I'm coming from, and that's why I'm quite... The debates within sociology have never really attracted me. Also, as a researcher, I am attracted to the concept of public service. This is what you found interesting. And therefore have been confronted as a public servant inevitably by the ethics involved in policy decisions of government of whatever political colour or affiliation. Public service was mentioned by several interviewees in my current research with Pat Marney on the impact of neoliberalism on higher education. As a counter to being a worker, an employee, or a marketeer, public servant has a different kind of status. This is not to say that researchers of education should not have the full set of entitlements of academia, for instance, freedom to speak out, autonomy, and so on. But perhaps we have to confront, if not reality, then at least the implications of our research for educational actors and participants. So I've always been conscious in my work that it has to have an applied aspect. I can't, otherwise, for me, it's not worthwhile. Third point, I joined BERA in its very earliest days. My first brief appearance was in 1976, when I'd taken off a year off from teaching to study for an MA in Curriculum Studies at the Institute of Education. I was completing a dissertation on education and the Sex Discrimination Act, which, when I started, I didn't think I could do research on gender. I thought it wasn't serious, and I was doing research on something else. And then my professor, who was Dennis Norton, said to me, why are you doing, I was doing special needs when you're really interested in gender? And I said, well, I didn't know you could do gender as a research topic. And so that's how I got to, started my research on, and it was on Education and the Sex Discrimination Act, which had been passed the year before. And I had as one of my supervisors, Margarita Rendell, who was a fiery feminist in the Institute of Education, who was a lawyer. And so she helped me with the legal aspects. And in fact, that was one of the first, and in fact, when I went to the National Foundation of Educational Research later on, and they published it, they took my final chapter of my thesis. I didn't know how to publish anything. And they took it, and Gabriel Shannon, do you remember? Published it in the NFER journal called, I can't remember what it's called now.
Education Research.
And it was quoted for years by the Equal Opportunity Commission. So it's quite interesting that I had no real part in publishing that, but it was published. I also helped in 1978 to run the first conference on gender and education under the auspices of BERA, with the late Alison Kelly, she sadly died recently, Jewel Kirkup, Maggie McClure, and the soul man David Hamilton. And we were called the Young Turks by Brian Simon, in case anything. For the next 20 years, BERA was the core organisation for me in terms of getting my research voice heard, trying out ideas, and connecting with other like-minded researchers. And we did a lot of disgraceful feminist things. We did a lot of women-only sessions that people hated, and we did a lot of dancing around our handbags at the end of, the BERA, sessions at the end. So it was good, a lot of fun. BERA at this time was enhanced. See, I'm a bit worried about the way BERA's gone, to be perfect, but maybe that's a generation thing. BERA at this time was enhancing rather than regulatory. Anybody could present a paper, and you didn't have to be refereed. And there were some pretty awful papers, but there's some pretty tremendous ones as well, from people who didn't regard themselves particularly as researchers. So that's a third point about BERA. Fourthly, I've been angry, and somebody mentioned anger. I've been angry for a long, yes, it was Sarah. I've been angry for a long, long time, and I'm always angry. And I felt angry when I went through Oxford yesterday. And in fact, a reason for going abroad in the first place to Sweden was exhaustion about always being angry under Thatcher and post-Thatcherism. I got exhausted in the end. I've been politically active for most of my adult life, and as you will see, much of my funded, I'm going to show you some of my research, funded research has, in one sense, been oppositional to political regimes. But the contradiction is that they've funded it, they've tolerated it. So they've been critical, and yet they've been funded. And I think that's a balance that critical researchers take all the way. We can be and we threaten with being co-opted or rejected. So either being co-opted by the regime or being rejected. Research for me has always had a political dimension which does not sit well with the requirement for objectivity and neutrality, and funding has always been something of a risky business. In preparing for this talk, therefore, I've revisited the various funded research projects with which I was involved, and I found it intriguing to reflect on which bodies funded what and how I came to be included. After 3 years as a primary teacher and having just finished my master's, I decided to see what other jobs were there before I returned to the always there classroom. I always thought of the teacher, it's always going to be there, let's see what else there was that I could do. I had young children, so couldn't stray far from London. I was appointed as teacher-researcher at the National Foundation of Education Research, a preferred category at the time for 2 projects, neither of which topics I had any expertise in. But what I had, which was what was wanted, was practitioner credibility, plus some evidence skill in research and writing, a combination that was quite rare. So I'd done this master's, written, and then I'm still a teacher, regarded as teacher. And my first projects, record keeping, I mean these were not the most theoretically sophisticated. Record keeping in the primary school, which is Schools Council, which was the main curriculum body at the time, and 1-year courses at 16 plus. And both, one had a book was published, and the second was a report. But working at the MFE, so though I wasn't particularly interested in the research, and in fact I was in conflict with some of the researchers because I didn't share their perspective. Working at the NFER was terrific research training. I learned to carry out research, write reports and newsletters, give BERA conference papers and get published. So it was, I know nowadays you do MSc, don't you? But this was practical. It was really practical. I was there for 3 years and it was just terrific for me. By now, my work on gender was beginning to be known through BERA mainly. And so BERA as a network was tremendously important, and probably still is, I think. And I published several papers from the NFER projects. I was approached by someone high up in the Schools Council to take up a part-time post as project leader of an innovative gender curriculum project. And I'll take it. It's called the Sex Differentiation Project. It seems that my political interest had captured the zeitgeist, and you mentioned the zeitgeist, or in Kuhn's terms, a paradigm shift. We were a youthful team of practitioners with new ideas based on new social movements. And in fact, it was only a year and a half funding, but it was tremendously influential in Britain, the whole of Britain, because we had newsletters, and feminism was of great interest to a lot of teachers, and we had the biggest newsletter distribution in the whole of the schools council. We were massively a tiny team, and what we did is we focused on what schools could do to address gender in their schools. So it's very much, it was teacher-researcher model. I can go into that later on if you want. So, but the thing is that we captured the zeitgeist. It was something that it wasn't, the schools council wasn't particularly interested. There was somebody high up who was, and we were a tiny team, but we were influential, and that's one of the things I want to say to you researchers, that you can have opposition in all sorts of ways, but it's always a possibility somewhere, if you're lucky, to create a pool of interest. From then on, my work on gender took off and was supported by a wide range of funding bodies, and they were very different in those days. And as you can see, there were it was a European funded project with Leonie Burton, an ESRC project, and I was one of the first to get, I was at South Bank at the time, I was the first ever education project, ESRC project they ever got, and they really celebrated that. Then there was the project with Mabinana and Mira David that led to, what's it called, book, no, I forgot. And then there were further research.
Is that the gender gap?
Yeah, closing the gender gap. I haven't put the publications in. So I was funded by a wide range of funding bodies, curriculum and research organisations, research councils, equality bodies, government departments, trade unions, we've got an NUT person here, local authorities and universities in the UK, EU and in Sweden. And one private company, Scandia, was actually funded by Scandia. Of course, there was non-funded research too, including my own PhD, which I did in an entirely different area, which was on a woman called Harriet Martineau. I was very interested in her education writing. And my current research, which is unfunded, is on neoliberalism and higher education. So I've always done research in the interstices, thank you. Interstices. But anyway, so this is the research in Britain, and then there are other funded research projects that I got when I was at South Bank, and it was around me being a professor of education, and so various bits of money would float in from that I got because I was a lead researcher in education. So teacher appraisal. Now, teacher appraisal was an association of teacher and lecturer, and that was a funded project that came to us because of our quality work. And then I've done some work on TVI. That was a local project, TVI. Deaf Students was another local project. And this one was one of the most important that I wanted to do. I'd been editor of Burge from 1990 to 94, and Barry Troyner, who died sadly, took over from me, and what we wanted to do a project on the whole process of getting published. And he died. It was a brilliant project. He died before it started, and in fact his replacement was somebody I didn't know he'd nominated, and the project really didn't do anything. But it was that's been the saddest. That's a disappointment in my research. So what you can see from the early 1980s to the late 1990s when I left for Sweden, I worked together mainly with other feminist scholars, or with people like Barry we shared a lot of interests. Not though, I supported Arsenal, he supported Tottenham, that was one of the conflicts. Mainly academics rather than practitioners or activists. Though we were activists in Bira, and at that time there was do you remember, Sarah, there was a lot of activism, feminist activism within Bira.
There was also a great row about the special issue on postmodernism, wasn't there?
I don't remember that.
Don't you? Oh, well, never
That
mind.
must have been later on.
We won't stop now.
So, and all the projects I did, they were small scale, very dependent on my local status as professor at South Bank. As I said, the publishing project was a huge interest of mine, and I was very excited. Again, my university was very excited because South Bank didn't get a lot of these kind of research grants. Although I was at South Bank when there was Miriam David was there, Diane Ray was there, Heidi Mertzer was there. So there were some very starry people at South Bank at the time. So but they all went off to other directions. So it was a very interesting time. Then I went to Sweden, and the reason I went to Sweden was that they were interested in my gender work, and Sweden is one of its major priorities across all research areas is gender, and it's identity. It's a national kind of branding. I've done quite a lot of work on trying to understand why gender is so important in Sweden. So I got a job in Sweden. It was great for me because I could leave Britain. I was so tired. I was so fed up with fighting. So when we talk about fighting now, we were fighting then, fighting Thatcherism, fighting post-Thatcherism. And I just wanted to go somewhere where I didn't care. I just wanted to go away. So unfortunately, I had somewhere to go. And I got a lot of research money in Sweden. And the interesting thing that somebody mentioned, I think Gabriel mentioned, is that I had much more influence on Swedish government than I ever did on British government. I was asked to join quite a lot of state sort of investigations, and and I remember that the Swedes were going down the line of biological differences, the reasons for biological differences between girls and boys, and I kind of steered them away from that kind of angle. So you were able to have an influence that I was never got as near as you did to the power brokers, never, ever. So I've always been on the edges. So in Sweden, I got involved in a very exciting project, actually, which was funded through Europe, which is why you must all vote to stay in, which was around anti-racism. And I don't know if you know Chris Gaby, he was an anti-racist researcher, and he had this wonderful idea of an anti-racist website. And it was a kind of stories of people, of different characters that had different ethnicities in their stories. And it caught the zeitgeist again in Europe, and it caught it in Sweden because we got an independently funded Swede Kid project. And we got prizes for this. It was very exciting. We went, it was a really good project, and it was linked up with Spain, and it was linked up with, it was 3 countries, Sweden, Spain, and the UK. A lot of the research I got in Sweden, as is normally the case in Sweden, is based on doctoral students. So you get money, and that gets a doctoral student who does a study in your particular topic area. And if you've got a good doctoral student, it's a wonderful project, and if you've got a bad doctoral student, it doesn't get anywhere. Fortunately, and Scandia was quite interested in funding the Swede Kid side of the project. And then, and as a result, in Sweden, I got quite a lot of, I got very much into anti-racism, because in Sweden at the time, this is before the recent immigrant, migrant numbers. It was a very, they did have minorities, but they had no conception of what minority meant. And even if you had a black face, you were seen as not Swedish. And people were always saying to you, where do you come from? And it really upset a lot of black students who'd been born in, a lot of black kids who'd been born in Sweden. So it was kind of going backwards from what I'd experienced in London. So I got involved in a number of a multicultural project, which was again tied to a doctoral student. And then I got quite a lot of money, multicultural, anti-racist issues. This is sweet. I haven't translated it. This is improved school-related health among students, and it was about health issues, health forward gender perspective on health education in schools, and it was funded by the Gender Research Board. And I worked with someone in health education that was in a different faculty. And in fact, it was it did quite well, and we got quite a few publications. It's quite highly rated. And then there was various other research projects there. And this was an interesting one, and maybe it relates more to Jeff's talk, because we were asked by the then Social Democrat government to do an investigation of, structural racial discrimination in schools, and we were part of a very big report, but there was a change of government, and the report just fell away. So that's the danger when you work for government. And other work that I did in Sweden was to do with teacher education, because I was based in teacher education, and then with something that I was involved with you in. It was a small project in Japan, comparative study of teachers' perception of school life and education reform in Japan, South Korea, Sweden, United States, and there was a big conference seminar about it in Japan. So let me just, where am I? So Sweden proved a turning point for me. My work on gender had been what attracted them to me. Took Jill how many 5 minutes? But my main job was getting funding for what doctoral students, as I've said. And as I said, the high point was the Sweden Kid, the Eurokid project. And then Scotland, I got involved. I came back in 2005. I got involved in a Scottish independent school project, which I think you were part of the assessor on, an assessor of the whole scheme. But that was very interesting because I got very angry when I went into independent schools, and how you research something you're angry at is quite difficult. And I don't think I was the best of objective researchers in that case. But we got a lot of publications out of that. And I think that's when I realised that somehow the need to publish had become very, very much stronger than when I was younger. And then I was asked by Europe, because I got a reputation in Sweden, not in Britain, for gender issues, and I did a report for the European Commission. And finally, I'm back in England, and this is what I'm doing now. I just want to finish. So what does my research profile suggest in terms of past, present, and future research? I think at one time it captured the zeitgeist. It captured and I think it was nothing to do with me. I was just there at the right time. And I think I don't want to create a triumphalist account, because I don't think my career has been triumphalist particularly. The work I did was modest, and it was usually qualitative. I had strong personal academic links. I worked with the same people over and over again in Sweden and in the UK. I worked with people who are reliable, who can write, who've got ideas. It's very important. Swedish research was mainly gender, but also ethnicity, and mainly funded for doctoral research. I was funded by a wide range of mainly state-funded bodies. Many were an outcome of successful research applications, but some were directly recruited. I was directly recruited to them. The size of the grant was not predictive of the quality of the publication. There was always a crisis of legitimation of education research. It was applied and not pure. It was open to criticism from hostile governments and policymakers. It was relatively low status of education as a research field. although I have always been proud to be an educational researcher. And I'm still angry after all these years, and I want to put up a quote by the journalist Suzanne Moore. And this is, like the journalist Suzanne Moore recently said in The Guardian, I still see class contempt everywhere. And I saw this when I was looking at Oxford. Let's just read it. This is about Hillsborough. Rages than 1960s, I love that. We have read it now. The question I want to put to everyone in this room, and I thought there might, I don't know how many are doctoral researchers, I thought that would be the main audience, is what have we as education researchers in the past and in the present been able to do about this war, which at this moment hurts girls and women more than boys and men, and what might we do in the future? I don't have an answer, and I'll go out to you. So what I've tried to show is a biography, it's a research biography. It's not, there was no, how shall I put it, intention. It mapped out. I went from one thing to another. I don't know whether it's possible now to do that. And is it, of my generation, is the possibility of developing quite a nice career in higher education? Has that closed off now? And the only impact I think I've had is on people, teachers in schools. Don't think, and maybe doctoral students, and once Swedish government. So that's, I'll stop there.